Потому что несколько лет подряд приезжают на коммуникации, и все делали какой-то прав, я всегда их приехал, у меня было мысль. А на раннем стадии можно говорить, он такие вещи говорил, понимаете, те, кто бывают, он его зовут. Я так говорю, такие же банальные, как очевидные. И вот скепсис, пришел по скепсису, они потом в конце все будут скепсис. А я то же самое, те же самые вещи, он победил, тем не менее, он так рассказывает, доходит до каждой вещи. Что это чувствует, это рядом, какая-то детка. Вы прям чувствуете, начинаешь не верить. Вот автор он рассказал здесь, он рассказал свою жизнь, и вдруг
Спасибо большое.
Раз.
Обязательно, обязательно. Здравствуйте, уважаемые коллеги. Мы начинаем сессию агломерации как центра экономического роста механизмы.
We are starting our session dedicated to the agglomerations as the centers for economic growth and mechanisms funding. This is of paramount importance. It's an open secret that the development of agglomerations has not only the regional or sovereign nature, but this is of global nature, because this brings together the human capital, ideas and technologies which will provide for the growth of sovereign and regional economies and capturing the markets of new economy. The Russian Federation also faces an important objective of dramatic improvement of the labor productivity, providing for the average growth rates going beyond the average global ones, and we can be supported by the major cities and agglomerations there. The panel is quite authoritative, and therefore we will determine how to determine the impact of the key agglomerations on the economy of the country and on the regions. What agglomerations and cities can be dubbed the key ones, and which can be regarded as the spinal cord of the Russian Federation, and actually how we can support the agglomerations and cities from the federal centers, and what objectives have to be put forward. Let me introduce to you our experts. We'll start with Natalia Trunova from the Center of Strategic Developments. The Moscow agglomeration is represented by Ms. Krychkova and Michael An, the Minister of Finance of the Moscow region. There is another representative from the regions, Alexander Shepilov, head of the Permanent Office of Sverdlovsk, and Mr. Babin, the Director of Departments from the Russian Equity Fund, will represent the investment community. So let me pass the floor to Natalia Trunova to set the tune of our today's discussion. Good afternoon, esteemed participants in our today's session. Philip, thank you so much. Mr. Sarejedinov. This is a very hot topic. Hot potato, as the reporters say. It's been discussed within the strategy of the spatial development of the Russian Federation. And I do think that everyone is engaged in the discussion of this document. And we have to distinguish the goals and objectives which we put forward to different territories. And I will try to show that in my report. If I still have some time, I will take your questions. We're speaking about the city agglomerations as the source of economic growth. It is well known that major cities, major agglomerations, big cities account for a big share of the global GDP. 780 global cities account for more than 60% of the global GDP. And according to the data, you may see the map made by Oxford Economist Group. In the course of the upcoming 20 years until 2035, the landscape of those global cities will change. This concerns the cities which are regarded as most successful and which will produce the biggest stake of this global GDP. If we look at the map, the red color stands for the ones which are most important at the moment, 25 cities which produce a big share of the global GDP, and that in essence are the drivers of the economic growth in the countries. Yellow color stands for those which will enter this group by 2035, and the blue ones are the ones that will retain their positions. More than 50% of these cities will be located in the Asia-Pacific region. If we compare the forecasts made by McKinsey done in the middle of the not years, in 2005 or 2006, there was a forecast published by McKinsey until 2025, and this is the most updated one in Russia. We will have only Moscow and the Moscow agglomeration, so it means that the global research centers are very skeptical about other cities, so they don't see anything else but Moscow in Russia. This is what was going on in the past 10 years. These are the global cities who entered Gov's rating. What countries improved their positioning, their ranking, moved up on the global cities map, and what are left. For instance, Russia retained its positions with only 2 global cities. Moscow certainly enters the first group, and St. Pete is located in the third group. And these positions correlate not only with the economy scale, but also this matches the quality of the economy. The documents which we prepared for the social and economic development of the Russian Federation assume that the innovative scientific and technological policy should go on as a hand in glove with the municipal policy. We have to set up a new type of urbanized zones to replace the existing agglomerations which already exist. And you just have to give an impetus to do that. We all know the examples from the European Union. Just let me quote 2 out of them, out of a big number of megacities which are being built, where We call them the European regions, which are being set up in Europe. And the Rysunsky region is known as American Valley, existing between Denmark and Sweden. This is an artificial region with their big prerequisites and certain advances in terms of the science and technologies, but they invest heavily not only in transport, but also into the development of the innovative infrastructure. In the framework of that region, we see 7 scientific parks and about 10 technological parks which are developing life science and biotechnologies. So this is about 40,000 jobs in the key areas of life science. This is about 28 hospitals which are working to attract clients from the European Union, offering high-tech surgery. This is about 500 new companies, 300 out of which have their own R&D sector. This structure was set up within 20 years, starting from late 1990s. In the year 2000, the bridge was commissioned, and suddenly this was sponsored by the university, which used to be quite a kinky structure, but now this is included into the European top list. The same is true of Vienna and Bratislava Metropolia. An agreement was signed between those two cities, and the key area for the development is about the transport infrastructure. You may get from one airport to the other one within 30 minutes, half an hour, and this is about support of the business integration and other processes. These processes and the urbanization actually has crossed the national borders. Why? Not only to make friends with the neighboring cities, but if the city or the macro region wants to position itself in the international market, to this end you have to boast some density of the activity, including the one in the area of human capital, educational sphere, etc., etc. What goes on here? Our project, which is actually being implemented by the order of the Russian government, we made a survey in 170 countries, following several criteria, such as the economic one, related to the gross municipal product, related to compensations rate, and also we use some social criteria, such as migration, demographic ones, availability for able-bodied people, also certain criteria related to the new specialization, the share of people employed at the high-tech innovative jobs where the entrepreneurs are active in the region, whether the new sectors are going up, and whether they enjoy necessary infrastructure. And there is a number of other criteria, such as the municipal environment. Out of 170 cities, only 60 are related either to the leaders or At least they can boast some potential. This is not a very pleasant and soothing picture of story. If we take 35 most advanced cities, this is the blue circle. 17 out of them, that's Moscow and a number of cities from the Moscow region, in essence build one integral structure. So means that we have not 35 advanced cities, but 35 minus 17, half of that figure. What should be done? The country should develop a policy related to the cities, not only agglomerations or metropolis or megacities, but this policy should embrace not only cities but also the rural areas to follow up the strategy which was developed. Every type of the territory should have its own goal, its own mechanism for the development. We know the Chinese story, how it moved forward over the last 25 years. Not 25 but 35 years, very consistently, starting with the development of the ports and harbors, cities. 14 of them, the system was launched late in 1980s, and now this goes further to the country, inland, helped them to employ the policy consistently to other cities. This is what was done by Germany in their own style, starting from 1970s. It started developing their own territory, starting with major cities, big cities, relatively big cities, and strengthening the communication between the cities. When we say that Germany cannot boast so many big cities, actually Frankfurt has the population of 500,000 people, but Frankfurt agglomeration has the population of 4 million people. The same is done in the United States when they are going to the macro level, building up agglomerations with their own specialization, their own transportation system, around 11 megaregions. This is what we spoke, bridging this topic with the Moscow Financial Forum. If we claim the role in the global economy, if we want to be a high-tech country which produces high-tech products, we have to add 4 more agglomerations to the 2 existing ones. Moscow metropolis and St. Pete metropolis are already at a totally different stage of the development. They have totally different problems. They have a more sophisticated structure which is already being built. And I'm sure that the representatives of Moscow and the Moscow region, Paulina and Mike, will tell us more about that. This is a really very sophisticated system, a multifaceted one, which has to be discussed separately. For other agglomerations, doesn't mean that this is the end of the list. It means that its structure subtly should change. Early in the year 2000, Volga region discussed how to build high-speed lines between all the cities with a population over 1 million. So they build up an image of a rapidly developing mega city, actually surpassing the one of St. Pete. This assumption rested on the economic specialization of those cities and the opportunity to operate in different industries. What should be done, in our opinion? At what indicators can be obtained, unfortunately not by 2025, but only by 2035?
As you know, all infrastructure investments are made not only in Russia but across the globe for mid-term or long-term. So speaking about the migration from the cities out into the rural areas, we have to plan ahead. So first of all, the higher education system development that we see in Novosibirsk region, in Tomsk. 10% of the able-bodied people work in the education system. That is the biggest figure across the country. We believe that for all the agglomerations, it should become a beacon and a way that all the investments should be made. So taking into account the university development, we believe that Tomsk is leading in that area and everybody should follow the example. If these centers are built only within the regional borders, they would not be as far-fetched as the ones that are built in cooperation between regions. Let me also speak about the project that involve entrepreneurial initiatives in the United States and many European countries. Universities are important investors alongside municipalities, and they create entrepreneurial infrastructure. The legislation in Russia is different. We have to deal with Rosimущество. If we don't create the opportunities for our universities to show entrepreneurial initiatives, then we would simply waste money. Developing business in various areas is also one of the important aspects. We should establish the network of scientific centers, think tanks, education centers, taking into account their particular goals and targets. There should also be a system for business support in the regions, and that is a very important project that should be implemented at the macro-regional level. Of course, there is also a need for a marketing strategy in every specific city, because we know that any university, any city has its own marketing policy. When foreign investors come to the market, they do not have a clear idea about who they should cooperate with. So it seems that it would be critical for this city agglomerations to be created. When we speak about the accelerated development project, we should take into account the population. If you want to create innovative environment, it should not be homogeneous. Any sort of heterogeneity is productive. Of course, if everything is the same, it is comfortable. But if we strive for innovation, we should attract people from the outside. We have to draw on new human capital. This agglomerations and cities should not take over all the resources. What we need them is to not simply take all the resources out of the country, but to involve investment from abroad, as well as foreign students and professors and highly qualified specialists. That's why I think that the legislation as regards citizenship should be facilitated. Russia is one of the most difficult to access countries around the world. So if we make it easier for some foreigners to obtain citizenship, that might bring about the inflow of highly qualified foreigners and those who study in our universities as well. The communications should also be improved. Russia is a vast country, and yes, we do not have enough roads. People used to say that Moscow was far away from St. Pete's. And now with the high-speed trains, they became closer. That's why we could make Russia better connected. You know, the train Sapsan, and it isn't even a high-speed rail, it is a decently speedy train, but it could be faster. I think the same railway should be built between Barnaul and Novosibirsk and in other regions as well. Social functions could also be distributed, taking into account the competitive edge of different regions. The city environment. As you know, in Russian cities today, it leaves much to be desired. I think many of you know the Urban Development Index, which was published by the Strelka Institute. Moscow is the leader. St. Petersburg is falling behind, but it's still on the second place. But I'd say and agree, because I'm myself from St. Petersburg, I say that we overexploit the heritage without developing the new, better infrastructure in St. Petersburg. The other places are occupied by cities with the population of over 1 million people, but they are far, far, far behind Moscow. We have the new plan for urban development. We're going to change the city image. Crucially, this project should be comprehensive. For instance, in Tomsk, we've built a huge urban development center, and we'd say that the city itself is not in the best condition, and the same could go for all other big cities with over a 1 million population. There were some improvements in Kazan, in Yekaterinburg. The new business centers are emerging, and I believe that we should build on that. Of course, I'm not going to tell you about all our proposals because that will make us stay here till tomorrow. But I think that urban development should have a particular status in the development strategies of agglomerations. Public transportation, housing, investment into education, all of that is extremely important. I think that housing is one of the important areas here. Another one is airports and other communications. While preparing for the Football World Cup, we have already renovated some of our airports, and I believe that the federal airports should be further developed, as well as federal hubs, so that all the transit flows could also bring in new investments. And I know that there are some other areas that are going to. I haven't said anything about Moscow, but I know you have a lot to say. Thank you so much, Natalia. Let me ask you one follow-up question. I think that Russia knows how to finance infrastructure, and Moscow is a good example of urban development that the regions are going to follow. You talked about Tomsk, and you said that there are 100 hectares of land that are to be developed. And I think all of that is somehow interconnected. You know that in all the cities there are 20, 30 hectares of land that should be re-urbanized. Today we are speaking about the funding. So what do you think? Should these centers be specialized? Should that be articulated within the national strategy, or would that be created bottom-up by grassroots movements? Are there any plans to invest at the federal level, or should we interact more with regional players? Philip, thank you so much for the question. Speaking about the inner city territories, if we want to redevelop the city centers, from 30 to 40% of the funding should be targeted to the main specialization of this region. Let's take the example of Yekaterinburg. Yes, they are going to create a huge business center. And everything that is built there is done for the benefits of those companies that are going to be present. Another project of a smaller scale, is implemented in Irkutsk. They're going to build Irkutsk city. That is the business center. I believe that from 30 to 40% of the new functions that we want to be developed in those agglomerations should be provided for that, but 30–40% should be directed towards housing, and 15% goes to commerce. So that's how the funds should be distributed. Of course, every city demands its own makeup of the funding and the areas where it's going to be invested. But now we should also speak about different instruments that we have, for instance, involving universities. In the United States, a lot of the reurbanization of the cities was implemented in cooperation with universities, and that's not the only example. Irkutsk, for example, the business center is built with the support of the private sector. But if there was some help or assistance provided by the municipality, that could really boost the project. So, you know that there is the potential in every region. And some of the companies would like to invest, and we should investigate that issue further. Thank you so much, Natalia. We spoke about the agglomeration development. Do you think that they soak out resources out of the country? Well, that makes me think about Moscow. We know that Moscow is the biggest agglomeration and the great producer of the human capital, but is developing much faster than all other regions. Polina, what is Moscow's take on the issue? Could you tell us about its role in the Russian economy and what is its cooperation with other regions? Well, you know, it's not a secret to anyone that the Moscow agglomeration has a strategic role to play in the Russian development. 10% of the population lives here, 20% of the GDP is produced in Moscow. 16% of investment come to Moscow. If we speak of investments without the investments into oil, that would be even bigger. As for the markets, I'd say that consumer product markets are the largest in Moscow, and over half of all products are consumed in Moscow. Moscow is the point of entry for foreign investment into the Russian markets. That is also the point of access to international markets for the Russian companies. Moscow is the biggest generator of jobs. We are speaking not of the jobs that are created in Moscow only, but Moscow creates jobs in other regions as well. Every 4% of growth in the Moscow GDP means 1% of increase in the GDP of the country. So we see that Moscow plays a great role. Is that good or bad? That's the question. If we take a look at the role that Moscow plays, taking into account the bigger picture, we see that we follow the international trends. And we cannot say that Moscow is not over-centralized. Well, you know, in Russia there are two big cities, Moscow and St. Petersburg. And the 5 biggest cities in Russia make up for 20% of the population. But in Canada, that figure is 50%, and in Australia, 60%. Of course, the climate is different in Russia. That could be one of the factors. But we cannot say that Russia is over-centralized as regards the economic activity. Moscow agglomeration is not even that big as regards the GDP for hectare of land. It's the 15th place in the world. Its role for the GDP of the country is not that big either. There are many countries where the biggest agglomeration produces over 50% of the GDP. Tokyo, for instance, or Seoul. Hence, we'd not be able to say that Moscow plays such a big role for centralization in Russia.
Russia is a vast country, and therefore there should be many more growth points. There should be not 1 or 2 growth points, but many more. And that's great that in the strategy for the decentralized growth, there should be more than 20 such points which are distributed on the whole territory of the country. And if we manage to set up at least 20 growth points which will provide for the productivity, labor productivity comparable with the one of the Moscow agglomeration, and investments which are comparable to the Moscow agglomeration, then we will get a build-up of the economic indicators in the country in general. And it means that the growth points scattered on the territory of the country will provide for the necessary conditions for adequate development, and it will improve the competitive edge of the country. Russia will be an attractive destination for tourists. But when we speak about growth points, it's good that it is enshrined in the strategy, but at the same time we have to be mindful that to provide for that, we need certain tools. It should not be left a lip service. The strategy for the decentralized development should bring about certain mechanisms supported by national projects and other documents, including the one of the federal significance. Any agglomeration project is a very hard one from the management standpoint. It involves a lot of municipalities and several constituent members of the Russian Federation, so in terms of funding and in terms of management, this is not a piece of cake. And the managerial mechanism has to be set up, and this question remains open. Second message I'd like to draw attention to is about the necessity to bring about more growth points. Such growth points have to have certain incentives. Moscow is not only a big economic hub, but also this is a major donor for the federal budget and non-budgetary funds. If we speak about the non-budgetary funds, actually what is being aggregated in Moscow, less than a half is being spent there. As for the rest, for instance, it is spent in other regions. For instance, the Moscow pension fund takes care of all the Moscow retired people and 10% of the retired people in other regions of the country. Doesn't mean that we have to redistribute these means. There is a tendency to redistribute the funds on other regions through the federal budget, and if this tendency is followed, there will be no incentives for the economic growth. The challenge is quite difficult. We have to boost the lagging behind regions, and at the same time we have to retain the incentives in the major growth centers. If we turn to the terms and corporate lingua of municipalities and the economics, we have to follow the paradigm that everything excessive should be removed and spent, and if we follow this, no incentives remain. Donor territories will survive, but not at the pace which we would like to see there. This has no simple answer. That's why the balance of the incentives for the growth and the necessity to accumulate the means remain top priority. And the last but not least thing I'd like to specify. This is what Natalia has already spoke about. Every growth point in Russia is important per se, but we have to connect them in order to complement to the effect of everyone. The closer the growth point is located to the center of agglomeration, the labor productivity is bigger. So closer to the center means what? This is not just about the physical space, but this is about the transport accessibility. And 90 minutes to the center of agglomeration 100 years ago, and 90 minutes to the center of agglomeration today is different in terms of the mileage. If we compare different agglomerations, we will see that we may set up extra or additional growth points, regional ones, and it will strengthen the economic density and economic efficiency. Thank you so much. I'd like to ask the following question. Really, the strategy for the decentralized development, probably for the first time in the Russian history, the cities are put ahead of anything else, and Moscow is developing as a city and agglomeration for quite a while. It has accumulated a lot of experience, but Moscow is much more advanced than other cities. So can the Moscow experience be replicated in other agglomerations which are only in their infancy? So the experience of Moscow is very multifaceted. Certain things can be replicated. And we have to judge by the approaches. What is so important about the development of the agglomeration? The quality, urban environment is so important, and the Moscow experience showed that really the urban environment may boost the social and economic development because it will draw the human capital, or at least it will decrease the outflow. If it is pleasant to live and to study and to work in the city, then people would not be leaving it. And secondly, an attractive urban environment would attract more people from abroad. So exchange students will come to the other country to study and for networking, to party all around. So if there are nightclubs, etc., it would be more attractive for the foreign applicants and students. And I do believe that there are a lot of foreign students in Moscow because of high quality of the urban environment. There are no versatile solutions. There is no one-size-fits-all. But there are certain typical ideas which can be applied everywhere and can be replicated. It would be great that in Russia we have not only one city which actually enters the top list or top ranking, but if we have 20 or more countries, then the growth will be boosted. We can speak a lot about the peculiarities of Moscow development, but still, city agglomeration has an impact on other cities and agglomerations, and Moscow region has become one single body, one single labor market. It is very difficult to regard Moscow and the Moscow region separately. And the connection between the Moscow region and Moscow, seen as one, is certainly quite interesting. Michael, my question goes to you. What's your vision of the Moscow region in the Moscow agglomeration? What's the place of the Moscow agglomeration in the Russian economy in general? What projects are being implemented in the Moscow region? How are they connected to the Russian economy in general? Thank you, Philip. Good afternoon. May I have my presentation? In essence, this is not a presentation, but rather a number of slides in order to support my bullet points. First of all, seeking the answer to the question, should everything be around the Moscow agglomeration? These slides I copied from our colleagues from the Ministry of Economic Development. Oleg Fomichov is the author. You may see 7 territories, regions of the Russian Federation, which generate half of the total growth since the year 2000 through 2015. Moscow and the Moscow region generally together account for 70% of this growth. We have to develop different growth points, but we have to support the strongest, provided the resources are limited. If the Moscow agglomeration that looks like a behemoth, like a big monster economic-wise, Natalia's presentation at the same time showed that globally this is just a star sparking in the sky, allowing Russia to be part of the Premier League. You may look at the Instagram users who make such maps and the activity of the cell phone network and other activities. Sadly, people are more drawn by Moscow, by St. Peter, and then actually there are less people, less activity in other regions. Our position is about the following. So we have to develop this region. On the one hand, it sadly robs other regions of the human resources. And look at the functionaries and officials who work in the federal government, in the Moscow government, for instance. A lot of them are not from Moscow. And on the one hand, the Moscow agglomeration provides the best resources, but at the same time, it then would commandeer people or second people to other regions. We have to focus on strengthening the role of the Moscow region, which will help us boost the country globally. What Moscow and the Moscow region are about. Speaking as seen through the eyes of a resident, there is no difference. Doesn't matter where the administrative boundary is, but the transport accessibility and the territorial infrastructure and the social infrastructure, recreational infrastructure are of a lot of importance, and certainly the jobs which are offered in different areas, in different industries. What Moscow agglomeration is, as seen through the prism of the Russian Federation, what Moscow and the Moscow region are about. The Moscow region actually has the square 18 times more than the one of Moscow. Moscow region can boast the second biggest budget in Russia. Its consolidated budget will amount to 620 billion, but at the same time, our budget is 3.5 times less than the one of Moscow. In terms of the gross regional product, we are 3 something times less. We are ranked number 3, second to the consolidated two-man region, which actually has integrated with Khanty-Mansi and Yamal-Nenets regions. In terms of the population, actually, Moscow has 5 million people more, but at the same time, there are a lot of commuters who are going to work to Moscow, adding to the value there, creating added value there. They are paying taxes there, and they are spending money there. But at the same time, they are living and they are serviced in the region. So we have a lot of Muscovites, Moscow residents, who have their country houses in the Moscow region, and 3 million owners of country houses. This is what we have in the region, and we are not complaining. Compared to other regions of Russia, we have much more resources, and we even have certain advantage compared to Moscow. We have a limited number of resources, but still we may upgrade our investment and infrastructural opportunities. We may invite tax residents and create new jobs. What we are doing, we compare different industries, the economy and the region, from the standpoint of the gross regional product and the tax input of these industries. We managed to highlight very interesting facts. Despite the fact that the wholesale and retail sale is number 1 in terms of its stake in the gross regional product, 25.8%, still this industry pays less taxes. Probably this is due to the shadow economy. Moscow region actually has 3 belt roads, the remote Moscow region and actually the ring road of Moscow. Ring road of Moscow has the potential similar to the one of Moscow, but the remote Moscow belt has the economy territorially comparable with the one of the regions of the central part of Russia, meaning that actually there is a lot of fluctuations. At the same time, we see that the industry pays a lot of taxes, and it is developed very well in the Moscow region, and it is going up. It rapidly is developing. Education has a big impact on the economy, and the tax revenue is bigger than its share of the global regional gross regional product. In essence, the financial sector holding structures give certain economic impetus, and tax revenues sponsor the regional economy. Do we have to compete, or do we have to cooperate with Moscow? That's the question. As we put it, co-competition. So we are competing in some areas because we try to draw our resources to setting up new jobs, to make life of our own residents more convenient. That's why we use the taxes and we use the investments in order to gentrify the territory, that people not only come to their country houses in summer, but that they would like to stay in the region, to work in the region, and study in the region. Hopefully, actually, by the end of next year, we will launch the Central Ring Road, which will become a real ring. And it will improve dramatically the transport accessibility. It will change the transport flows in the Moscow region. And even provided the current situation, such as inflation going up and certain inflation pressure would be seen, the domestic demand is limited, and more sanctions, but still the Moscow region has some investment potential, unlike other Russian regions. But still, our main objective in the Moscow region is to determine the territories which may give us the biggest effect from the standpoint of the development. We have 18 times more territories and 3.5 times less budget. That's why we don't have enough money in order to gentrify the territory, to improve the infrastructure, to build more hospitals and schools. The same is true of the water supply, heat supply, etc. The Moscow region is more innovative than the one you saw 3 or 5 years ago. But what do we have to focus on? We bet on the potential which we still enjoy, high consumer demand, which helps us to rely on the fact that administrative tax and other incentives will boost the development of the tourist and recreational clusters. The Moscow region has the gravity centers for tourists, both for the days off or during the summer or during different holidays or festivities.
So we see the inflow of people. The infrastructure is also quite well developed. However, there are some underinvested areas around Moscow. The southern directions, with the cities of Kolomna and others. So I would say that they are quite underinvested. There are no good hotels, even though there are new museums, new restaurants opening. The territory has got great potential. It's got waterways. We need to attract resources to develop this territory, to improve communications there, to make it accessible by bike. And it overall should be more attractive for a tourist. That is only one example, and we have many of territories which are quite similar. There are also regions with a big potential for industry. They're mainly concentrated in the north. They could give quite a lot of funds in taxes. And how could that be brought about? Through improving the industrial centers there. The industrial park in Moscow, for instance, is quite well staffed. It's about 18,000 people, but we know that there is some good potential for improving industrial clusters, not only in Moscow but in other regions. Let's think about Tatarstan or Kaluga. There is a great potential for food industry. Compared to other industries, it is behind only the extracting ones. The examples of Voronezh or Tula show that there are huge industrial clusters that can be created. So that would be one of our targets. Another area is business clusters. Well, definitely we might not be able to satisfy everyone because our funds are quite limited. But when we speak about Moscow, of course, here the situation is better than anywhere else. As I've already mentioned, business centers attract more investments. The potential new centers would be Krasnogorsk. There is the new metro station that's opened there. McKinnon, that's what I'm referring to. Moscow City is one of the examples, but we are also going to establish new business centers nearby the Paveletskaya train station and in other places in Moscow, so that would allow for the companies to have a better choice of where to have an office. There is the huge potential in Domodedovo. 32 million passengers come across every year. There is the huge transit from the CIS countries. The territories around the airport that were not developed are about 17,000 hectares. So that's a huge potential, and we are going to use it. One last point that I'd like to make. We have the resources. We are going to make our budget more investment-oriented. There are about 500 billion rubles that are invested in the development of the Moscow agglomeration. So we already have the funds that are going to improve the development, and that should also strengthen the ruble. Right now, we're carrying out tests in different centers. There are 10 of them. There are special teams of investors. Together with experts, they're developing strategies for industry's development. Unfortunately, Mr. Ivanov is not here, but let me say that without the federal investment, we might not be able to develop the transportation. We need the federal funding here to connect the different centers of growth around Moscow, because that will boost the potential. So here we cannot do it with the municipalities only. We need the help of the federal budget. Thank you. Thank you, Mikhail. We are running short of time. Let me turn to the next speaker. We've spoken about the regional development. We've spoke a lot about Moscow. Chelyabinsk was mentioned as one of the growth centers for the Urals federal region. What's your take on this? Hello, dear colleagues. Thank you so much for giving me the floor. Let me first express my view as regards the previous speakers. So far, we were speaking about agglomerations, but the only agglomeration we spoke about was Moscow. Well, even though I represent Chelyabinsk, I work in Moscow. And that's a typical situation. I'm not going to ask whether it's good or bad. That big Moscow region dominates the economy of our country. I think it's pointless. Let's ask another question. What should be done so that other growth centers would develop quicker than Moscow to make up for the difference in their development, to catch up with Moscow somehow? The first thing is good management. What decisions are to be taken for the regions to be able to catch up with Moscow? You said about the decentralization strategy, but I think there is one more document that is quite interesting. It's going to be adopted in October. This is the comprehensive plan for the highway development. I think that should improve communications in our country. That plan is going to be operative for the next 6 years. And I think that will make us able to think about the real priorities. And I think that story is a lot more closer to life. Than the strategy of decentralized development that we've been discussing prior to it. In Chelyabinsk, there is the high-speed highway from Yekaterinburg to Chelyabinsk. And I think that's important not only for our region, but for the whole country. We're speaking also about the high-speed train between the two cities. If that is launched, that's going to be beneficial for the whole economy of the country, because that will allow for us to concentrate greater human capital in the Urals region. I'm not speaking about going to Siberia or Far East, but let's at least decentralize up to the Urals. I think that would be quite interesting to know what Natalia is thinking about this idea. When we're speaking about the high-speed railway, that could not yield results right away. If we think about the impact, it goes a lot further. And that's what the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Economy has to assess, and all their assessments would be different, because when we speak about the agglomeration impact, we know that it's not only the railway itself that yields funds and money. Therefore, it would be interesting to know how this similar projects are developed abroad. How do they manage to get across their initiatives? We know that the Ministry of Economy deals with itself somehow on its own, and that would be very interesting to have a look into that. Chelyabinsk is developing along other regions and cities in the Urals. The BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Forums will be held in Chelyabinsk. I really hope then the next expo will be held in Yekaterinburg. That will enable us to improve the transportation infrastructure and communications. So this is the first point I wanted to make. The second one is that the one that is connected to Natalia's report. Agglomerations across the globe are developing because of different factors, and it's quite instructive for us. Let's think about what we could do with this trend. I'm speaking about the federal level, but then also about the regional level. We know that agglomerations are going to develop by themselves. They're going to attract resources. Let's think about the management strategies that we could apply for them to be more beneficial as regards the country's economy. Maybe not all agglomerations in Russia and in our regions are the ones that comply with international standards, but we have several of them. In the Urals, 4 of them. So when we speak about decentralization, we are basing on the priorities that we set out. That 7 million people are in our agglomeration, and it was one of those that were leading across the country. The participants of the municipalities invest their funds and make contributions to the fund of the agglomeration, but there is no good management mechanism. We tried to adopt the regional law on agglomerations, but the prosecutor's office was against it because there is no federal legislation. There is a law on self-management of the regions, but it's not enough. I'll give you another example. 2 municipalities in the agglomeration share the border. If there is a hospital in one municipality, and the people from the other municipality think it's easier to access the other municipality's hospital, but they cannot do it because they are registered in their municipality, even though the hospital is located further away. Within the Russian legislation, as it is today, this problem is very difficult to solve. The same goes for education facilities and other social areas. The other important aspect is the financing of large municipal projects. So far, there are no clear-cut instructions or mechanisms to deal with this area. We want to invest in one municipality, and the project is being implemented, but without the cooperation with other municipalities, it becomes a lot less efficient. The high-speed railway from Chelyabinsk to Yekaterinburg, it should be co-financed by the federal entities' budgets. There are also partners who are ready to cooperate, but there is no really clear mechanism for the co-funding by different entities. So now, making the long story short, it seems crucial if we want for agglomerations to be successful and beneficial, because now they are the centers of economic growth. But what is to be done with our management mechanisms to make this trend more beneficial for everyone? Now, speaking about the strategy, of course, if we want to have a new development strategy, that means that we want to change something for the better. The key factor or the key indicator is the structure of our budget spending. If we change the structure, if we introduce something new and reject something that doesn't work, then that would mean that our strategy, the new strategy, is being implemented, is underway, but otherwise it would stay simply a draft.
Speaking about the development of the agglomerations, we have to keep track of this indicator. Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, we have listened to the expert opinion, we have listened to the regional opinion, and it's high time to pass the floor to the investment community. I would like to give the floor to Mr. Babin from the Russian Private Equity Fund. We have to develop the cities, and we have to engage regional tools, private capital, etc., etc. I have the following question. You are one of the main centers which welcomes major foreign investors, and the cities certainly are the places where the investment capital go. What priorities you set in order to attract investments into the city infrastructure? Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Really, you noted correctly that the Russian Private Equity Fund acts as a high-quality investment screen, selecting the best projects and attracting foreign investments. Ever since 2011, when our fund was set up, together with our partners, we invested into more than 50 projects, to the total amount of about 1.3 trillion Russian rubles. And actually, we invested only 300 billion, whereas 1.2 trillion rubles were invested by our core investors. We have a lot of core investment projects with the foreign investors, including the strategic investors and the sovereign investors. If we look at the portfolio of our companies, then they cover 95% of the regions of the Russian Federation, and certainly, and due to some reasons, more than 30% of the total number of projects go to the Moscow agglomeration, but money-wise, this amounts only to 20% of our fund, and 80% of the money invested went to other regions. You asked me what are the key investment directions, what we focus on in the cities. I would highlight 5 main areas. First of all, improvement of living quality or living standards. Secondly, development of the infrastructure, development of the regions, improvement of the labor productivity and manufacture. So actually there are 6 such things. Import substitution and taking advantage of the export potential of the Russian manufacturers, and technological development. This is number 6. Out of all 6 things, we prioritize the investments into the infrastructure as they amount to 40% out of our portfolio, and technologies are number 2. Actually, we'll spend 25% of our total investments into that. Those 2 directions will allow us to provide for the high-quality growth of the agglomeration in the Russian Federation. To put it more specifically, speaking about the projects which we are implementing at the moment, we are investing into the adjacent highway next to Leninsky Avenue, the central ring road, together with private equity fund from Saudi Arabia or UAE. We set up a logistics center. This experience will be replicated further on in the regions. I have mentioned technologies, and in terms of the technologies, we focus more on healthcare. We are investing into X-ray and other radiological centers in Moscow region. This is the first concession in the nuclear medicine. We managed to invite a strategic partner to develop such centers in Russia in general. For quite a while, we are cooperating with the mother and the child company. We built hospital in Lapino. Now we are building a whole chain of hospitals in Russia. This complies with our strategic goals to improve the living standards of the Russian citizens, and this is also about import substitution. In terms of technologies, so we set up a special technological fund to the tune of $1 billion together with our Saudi partners, and now we are starting different technological applications and projects. Another project which is of major significance for the agglomeration, this is our program to do the environmentally friendly recycling of garbage together with our foreign partners. We are looking for potential investments opportunities here now. Recycling and incineration opens up a lot of opportunities, and it may be very interesting for investors. As for the private investors are concerned, how they may invest into the agglomeration, certainly we may take advantage of the PPP, either through concession mechanism or through special investment contracts, not only to draw the investors' capital, but also to draw the expertise, operating opportunities, because such mechanisms may provide for certain warranted yield. This is what would make the investors happy Also, we rely on setting up the infrastructural fund. This is what First Vice Premier Mr. Solanov spoke about, and will act as a kind of a filter, as the checkpoint for the applied projects. And finally, let me tell you that thanks to our work with the foreign investors, we see that there are some global projects, including the global ones, such as building the city of the future called Neom. This is what Prince Mohammed Al Salman spoke about. Japanese smart cities is another our investment destination, and talking to our foreign investors and partners, we see that there are certain opportunities in other projects, and we seek certain opportunities to replicate their experience in Russia for more, to make Russian projects more attractive. Thank you so much. Actually, we are out of time, but I do think that should we have certain questions from the floor, we can dedicate 3 to 4 minutes to that. If there are no questions, let me abuse my role of a moderator, asking the question to the last speaker. Is there a demand for the investments into Russia on behalf of foreign investors? Are they eager to invest? Well, I would not speak about demand for the investments into the Russian cities, but rather demand for the investments into the investment projects. Because usually we have to compete with the investment projects. We have to understand why the investors are putting their money into something. So there are 3 or 4 components. First of all, the investors try to diversify their risks, and Russia is quite attractive as a part of the emerging markets landscape. Secondly, the yield or profitability. As the fund, we believe that it is quite significant, as providing for certain yield, warranted yield, above the comparable projects abroad. It may help us to attract more investors. We managed to find such projects, but in order to ensure such a yield, as I said, we need certain guarantees or warranties of financial yield from the state. It can be provided by certain tools which are available. The third reason is the resources. This is less important for a number of investors, and this component is less important. And the fourth one is the technological one. Our fund, as I said, we have set up a technological fund that certain unique technologies available in Russia could drive foreign stakeholders, and therefore it could be replicated in other countries. The investors show their interest to such an approach. So in a nutshell, that's it. There is some interest, and it is not driven by certain cities, but rather driven by certain investment projects available. And where they are located geographically is of no matter. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank all our panelists, and let me say that it's a great pleasure for me to keep track of this discussion, and I see that it goes away from discussing whether we have to support the cities as the growth points, but rather we're speaking about how we may support them. Thank you so much.